by the MF Center for the Advanced Study of Religion. We are very honored and also very happy to have with us today Professor Ute Hüsken from Heidelberg, who will give this lecture and has been willing to offer it despite the fact that we are living in fairly troublesome and I would also say unnerving times. I think that we are happy that we can have it, not due to the present circumstances. And it is therefore with pleasure that I hand over the word to the daily chair of MF CASR, Kristin Ovisland, who will introduce the speaker today.
Thank you. Yeah, I also have to say that I regret that we don't fill the biggest auditorium at MF this afternoon, and that we don't gather together afterwards, mingling and nibbling and cheering festively. But I'm still very, very happy that MF CASR annual lecture takes place despite the ongoing and frustrating epidemic. And before I introduce Ute Hüsken, I will say a few words about the course of this event. There will be a short break, 10 minutes or so, after the lecture, before we reconvene for a common discussion. And this session after the break will start with 2 brief responses, and then follows an open conversation to which I encourage everyone to take part. And then you'll use the Q&A tool to post your questions and comments, which you find that tool at the bottom line of your Zoom screen. And I will present your questions and comments to the panelists. And I will repeat this procedure after the break also. So then, it's a very great pleasure to introduce you to this year's lecturer, distinguished professor of, Ute Hüsken of Heidelberg University, esteemed scholar of South Asian studies and knower of numerous languages and cultures in that region of the world. Professor Hüsken received her doctorate in 1996 at the University of Göttingen and has been affiliated to the University of Heidelberg in different capacities, from 2007 as a professor of the Sud-Asian Institute. Professor Hüsken is no stranger to Oslo either, and the Norwegian scholarly community, because in 2007 she was appointed professor at the University of Oslo, and then stayed in this city for 10 years, I think. And we at MF CASR hope to welcome her back to Oslo in person as soon as travel is again possible. Ute Hüsken's research especially concerns religious cultures in Buddhist and Hindu traditions, and her multiple books and articles revolve around topics as ritual, material culture, and gender. And in various studies and projects, she has addressed the issue of female religious agency. On basis of a rich and varied material, she has developed insights about the diversity of religious and cultural roles of women, insights that teach us challenging lessons about the complexities of female agency. The title of her talk today is Female Agency and Religious Conservatism, New Roles for Women in Hinduism. So ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, I am proud to give you Professor Ute Hüsken, please.
Thank you very much, Kristin, for this very nice introduction. And Yes, I'm very sad that I cannot give this lecture in Oslo today, because I was so much looking forward to coming back to Oslo, spending some time with good old and new academic friends, and but hopefully this will be possible sometime soon. So I feel extremely honored to be invited to give this annual lecture, and I especially would like to thank Professor Kristin Arvidsland, Professor Liv Ingeborg Lied, and Professor Iselin Friedelund, who were instrumental in connecting me back to my old academic home, Oslo. I would also like to thank, just before I forget it, all the technical assistance, everyone who's helping in making this happen in spite of the fact that we cannot be together right now, and also to the respondents who agreed kindly to engage with my thoughts on the topic. So I will be talking about female, I should wait. Now the first challenge starts. I will share my screen and do it in the right way. Let's see whether we can do it. Yes? Good. So I will be talking about female agency and religious conservatism, and the material I will present to you and on which my reflections are based are new roles for women in Hinduism. In short, in an increasing number of contexts in contemporary India, women can and do undergo priestly education, and they can receive initiation as Hindu religious specialists. This is new in what I call Sanskrit Hinduism, which is a set of traditions that explicitly exclude women from holding positions of public and religious ritual authority. My two case studies are about such processes or situations in India in which women and girls claim and execute public, religious, and ritual agency. I will first introduce the historical and textual background, that is, show that and how women have been and still largely are excluded in these traditions. And I will address the following questions. Why and how do the women try to integrate in a tradition that explicitly excludes them? What are the experiences of the women involved, and what are the competing agendas of the diverse stakeholders, including the men involved in the processes? While walking you through these topics, I will also address a dilemma which continues to haunt me when I reflect on notions of agency through the lens of these conservative religion cases from India. Sanskrit Hinduism is conservative in the sense that it claims to follow or to be based on religious texts which are of divine origin and which therefore cannot be changed. Many of these Sanskrit texts, and here I'm talking about texts that were authored by Brahmin religious specialists from the second millennium of the BCE onwards, state that members of lower castes, but also women, are excluded from the right to learn and to engage in specialized religious and ritual practice and recitation. The texts reserve the right and obligation of this kind of learning and initiation into priesthood to male members of Brahmin communities. And Brahmins, a collective term for members of several castes that according to their normative texts are in charge of religious practice and transmission, are also called twice born, as the initiation they undergo is considered their second birth, called Upanayana. Members of castes that are not considered twice born, but also women, are entirely excluded from the right to learn and to exercise specialized religious and ritual practice. At least this is the interpretation of men who claim authority regarding ancient Hindu traditions. And it is a widespread perception today. A recurring argument is here that women cannot undergo the initiation called Upanayana, which enables a person to learn and to perform Sanskrit rituals. This initiation encompasses the conferral of the so-called sacred thread, and here we see a situation where this is actually happening right now, the sacred thread to the boy, as well as his initiation into the secret Gayatri mantra. This initiation ideally marks the introduction of the boy into the study of Vedic texts and practice. Without this initiation, a woman does neither have access to the required knowledge, nor does she gain eligibility or adhikara to perform rituals for others. Often, Manu's Dharma Shastra is cited here, a normative text from around the beginning of the Christian era, where we find the following verse. For women, tradition tells us, the marriage ceremony equals the rite of Vedic initiation. Serving the husband equals living with the teacher, and care of the house equals the tending of the sacred fires. A young man's initiation into Vedic learning is equated here with a woman's wedding, and his service to his teacher with her service to her husband. The opinion in general prevails among contemporary male Brahmins that without this initiation, women can and should not act as ritual and religious specialists in the position, for example, of a domestic or, God forbid, a temple priest. Whatever the situation might have been at different junctures of Indian religious history, that is, whether we see here an idealized picture from a male Brahmanic perspective or a description of the status quo historically, today Orthodox Brahmins, as well as the so-called common man, will certainly claim that women cannot perform religious rituals for others. Here I will simply let you hear some voices who claim so.
महिलाओं को देखा है ये पुरोहित का काम करते हैं।
पहले तो नहीं करती थी, अभी कर रही सब महिला कर रही।
आपको क्या लगता है ये ठीक है?
अभी तो आए भगवान के सारी उल्टी पलटी दिन आ गए क्या, नहीं तो पहले भगवान के मंदिर में स्त्री कभी जाती नहीं थी।
शास्त्रों में या वेदों में कुछ लिखा है कि उनको
वो हमें कुछ मालूम नहीं है। हम तो कि
आपका क्या मत है कि स्त्रियों को करना चाहिए या नहीं करना चाहिए?
नहीं, हम नहीं कुछ बोल सकते।
महिला पुजारी नहीं, महिला पुजारी नहीं। वेदों में तो स्त्रियां पौरोहित्य करने का संदर्भ नहीं है, लेकिन उनका वेदाध्ययन करते थे उसका रेफरेंस भी है। लेकिन आज तो क्या हो गया है, उनका उपनयन संस्कार यानी कि मौंजी बंधन वही नहीं होता है, इसलिए आज उनका पौरोहित्य करने का विरोध है। क्योंकि पौरोहित्य करने के लिए वेदाध्ययन करना पड़ता है और वेदाध्ययन करने के लिए एलिजिबिलिटी करके ये उपनयन संस्कार वो तो करना पड़ेगा। आज उपनयन संस्कार ही नहीं हो रहा है, इसलिए स्त्रियों का वेदाध्ययन नहीं होगा और वेदाध्ययन नहीं।
Yet, in spite of textual prohibitions and prohibitions in practice, more and more women implicitly and explicitly question this male monopoly. When I first heard about female Hindu priests, I was both enthusiastic and very curious. On top of this, as a philologist used to reading the normative texts of these traditions, and with many years of work with male Hindu temple priests in South India, I assumed that these women were resisting in the first place, resisting hegemonic male Brahmin discourse and practice. Little did I know, and there was a lot to learn from me. I encountered such female Hindu priestesses for the first time in Pune, the self-declared intellectual capital of India, a big, prosperous city, which at the same time is also a stronghold of Brahmanic learning and Sanskrit scholarship. The rituals performed by these priestesses in Pune are, for example, life cycle rituals of members of their clients' families. These might be weddings, initiations, or ancestor rituals. The language of the rituals, the liturgy, if you want, is Sanskrit and is based on the texts that are part of the ancient Vedic corpus. Not only are female priests operating in Pune, here one can even get the impression that women are slowly taking over and soon might even outnumber the male priests. But what about the male priests? In many interviews, I heard that the acceptance of female priests is closely connected to the lack of a sufficient number of male priests who can respond to the increasing popularity of Sanskrit rituals in contemporary urban middle-class India. People who support priestly education for women often express dissatisfaction with the services of traditional male priests. Their dissatisfaction is based on three interconnected issues. The traditional male priests do not take enough time for their performances. They demand excessive salary for their services, and yet they are not able to explain the meaning of the rituals they perform to the clients who sponsor the rituals. In this situation, the services of female priests are very welcome, since they do rituals for fixed rates and within a time frame agreed upon with the clients, and they are trained and even eager to explain the rituals they perform to their clients. Clearly, female ritual performers became popular and are now an integral part of the religious landscape of Pune. Most important for the success of the women is their popularity among the ritual hosts who employ them for the services. These hosts are usually middle-class Brahmin families who, on one hand, consciously want to connect to their tradition, and on the other, their worldview requires them to reinterpret the tradition and rituals they perform. The female priests' education and attitude fit very well into this pattern. Today, there are many small private training groups for women in Pune and some institutions that educate women in Sanskrit rituals. Moreover, there are many individual women who perform rituals for those who approach them. Many, though not all, trace their lineage in one way or another back to Mama Tate, a male reformer who established a training center for female priests in the second half of the 20th century in Pune. When he first started his training program, it was hardly noticed. However, when the women were actually invited to perform rituals for more and more clients, strong opposition was voiced by the male priest and by Orthodox Brahmins at large. Let us have a closer look at this criticism. Firstly, the critics claim that the women deviate from the norms fixed in the authoritative texts, since according to these texts, women are not allowed to perform the rituals as they cannot undergo the required initiation. Secondly, the female body is declared to be not suited for the task. And thirdly, the social role of women is seen as not compatible with the duties of ritual performers. While there are different responses to the critique, it is taken seriously. The women relate to it rather than simply dismissing it. The criticism that the women are acting against the text has never been taken lightly. Many passages in the Sanskrit literature can be cited as a proof that women cannot be performers of Sanskrit rituals. And paradoxically, the priestesses in fact accept and value the normative Sanskrit texts that exclude them. The women are no rebels against the tradition, but wish to be integrated into and to be active participants in the tradition. In response to this criticism, the women refer to other passages in the same texts, which suggest that women might in fact have undergone Upanayana initiation at some point in the past, but that this tradition has been abandoned. Others accept the traditional stance that marriage is the initiation for women, and that the Mangala Sutra, the thread that is tied around the neck of a woman during the wedding ceremonies, is a woman's sacred thread. And again, other women undergo initiations that they see as equivalent to the male priest's Upanayana. These rituals resemble the Upanayana for boys in varying degrees. Repeated criticism is also related to the female body and its assumed impurity. In Brahmin worldview, menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth are connected to periods of strong ritual impurity. Again, these arguments are never simply dismissed by the women. Most, but not all, of the women I talk to in fact observe traditional Brahmin menstrual restrictions. That means that they withdraw from social life for the first 3 or even 4 days of menstruation. And again, I give the microphone to some of the performers.
शुची आणि असुची यामध्ये काय फरक काय?
शुची म्हणजे साधारण पवित्र, अगदी शुद्ध असं, आणि शुची म्हणजे अशौच म्हणतात तर साधारण बायकांच्या एमसीचे महिन्याचे 3 दिवस, किंवा डिलिव्हरी झाली तर ते 10 दिवस, किंवा एखादी व्यक्ती गेली तर त्या घरातले ते 10 दिवस, हे अशौच अशुची झालं असं.
मग ते पौरोहित्यामध्ये ह्याचं कसं काय तुम्ही?
नाही, ते यायचंच नाही. ते आधीच सांगायचे की 3 दिवस यायचं नाही म्हणून. आणि त्यातून त्यावेळी आमच्या बायका कमी होत्या तयार, असं 11 तयार होत नव्हत्या. मग त्या आदल्या दिवशी सांगायचे, 3ऱ्या दिवशी रात्री उपासाचं खायचं, 4थ्या दिवशी 2 आंघोळी करायच्या आणि मग यायचं तुम्ही असं. इतके ते तसे कडक होते, शिस्त आणि नियम असं पालन करणारे.
स्त्री का मासिक धर्म होता है तो उस समय उसे अशुद्ध और इम्प्योर कहा जाता है, तो आप हमें बताएंगे इम्प्योरिटी और ये मेंस्ट्रुएशन कब जुड़ गए और ये धारणा कैसे बनी?
ये तो जागतिक तौर पर ऐतिहासिक परिप्रेक्ष्य में देखें तो सभी जगह में था पहले, लेकिन probably after World War the situation is changed, but before in each religion menstruation was censured. So सभी जगह उसकी निंदा ही की गई है, क्योंकि मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि उसमें जो यूजिंग ऑफ ब्लड होता है, जो रक्त आता है, उससे हिंसा का संबंध जुड़ गया, इसलिए उसको अशुभ माना गया है. और ज़्यादा तौर पर पितृसत्ताक पद्धति में तो ऐसा देखा जाता है कि मेंस्ट्रुएशन अशुद्ध माना गया है. मातृसत्ताक पद्धति जहाँ भी होती है तो उसमें उसको रिसीव करते हैं अच्छी तरह से. बाद में कई जगहों पे उसको रिसीव किया है अच्छी तरह से, कई जगहों में उसकी निंदा की गई है, ऐसा दिखाई देता है.
लेकिन ज्ञान प्रबोधिनी में हम ऐसा कहते हैं कि जो मासिक धर्म है वो निसर्ग की ही देन है हर एक महिला को, क्योंकि क्या होता है कि संतानोत्पत्ति के लिए हर महिला को ये अधिकार निसर्ग ने खुद ही दिया है. तो जो नेचुरली उसे मिला है उससे वो अशुद्ध कैसे कहे जा सकती है, जिससे एक नया जन्म होता है. तो इसलिए हम ज्ञान प्रबोधिनी में ऐसा सोचते हैं कि नहीं, ये अशुद्ध अपवित्र ऐसा नहीं है, और हम हर एक स्त्री को ये अधिकार देते हैं कि उस 4 दिन के काल में भी अगर उसे कोई पूजा वगैरह करनी है, बस उसका मन प्रसन्न होना चाहिए और शारीरिक दृष्टि से उसे कंफर्टेबल लगना चाहिए कि हाँ मैं ये कर सकती हूँ.
यजुर्वेद में तैत्तिरीय स्कूल में तैत्तिरीय शाखा की जो तैत्तिरीय संहिता है, वहाँ ऐसी एक आख्यायिका उसके बारे में उपलब्ध है कि इंद्र ने ब्रह्म हत्या की और ब्रह्म हत्या का पातक इंद्र को लगा और वो ऐसा पूरे जग में फिरने लगा, मैंने गलती से ब्रह्म हत्या की, अभी क्या करने का, ये मेरा पातक क्या करूं. तो स्त्रियों ने उसका पातक अपने शरीर पे ले लिया और उसके बाद हर महीने में उनका मासिक धर्म शुरू हो गया. इसीलिए वेद के आधार से, इस आख्यायिका के आधार से जो ब्रह्म हत्या का पातक है, वो पातक यानी कि स्त्रियों का मासिक धर्म. और धर्मशास्त्र क्या कहता है कि 3 दिन में उन्होंने कुछ भी करना नहीं, यानी कि स्वयंपाक नहीं करना, कुछ काम नहीं करना, क्योंकि उनको जो कुछ ये ब्लीडिंग होता है, यानी कि बहुत बैक्टीरिया वो आ जाते हैं, इसीलिए उनको
Others explain this practice not in terms of impurity, but rather argue that the mantra Om, which is uttered during all rituals, affects the uterus negatively. Several women therefore think it is advisable to start performing rituals only after menopause sets in. The traditional idea of ritual purity and impurity is accepted, yet reinterpreted in terms of biomedicine. It is often mentioned that the social role of women as caretakers of children does not allow them to go to the ritual hosts' houses when they're required to do so. And in fact, only few of the middle-class Brahmin housewives among the priestesses have small children to take care of. Many of their grown-up children live and work abroad. For these women, their social duties are not in conflict with their desire to be ritual performers. On the contrary, learning to perform Sanskrit rituals and engaging in performing for others is a very prestigious occupation for them. It also creates a respectable space for these women to get together without their husbands. Two women explicitly told me that they enjoy going on pilgrimages with other women priests, since during that time they do not have to take care of their retired husbands at home. Widowhood is another aspect to the performance of Sanskrit rituals by women, which is connected to ritual impurity on the one hand and social obligation on the other. Many of the active priestesses are around 60 years old, and some are widowed. The status of widows is very difficult, especially in Orthodox families. In Orthodox Brahmin worldview, the death of the husband entails a woman's social death. Widows are not invited to auspicious occasions anymore, which reduces a widow's social life not only ritually, but also practically. From an Orthodox Brahmin viewpoint, widows are definitely not among potential ritual specialists. Yet it seems that widowhood in the contemporary middle-class urban Brahmin setting does not interfere with the women's priestly occupation. More than with regard to the other two major points of criticism, the response to the argument that a priest's profession is not compatible to a woman's social duty, the response differs, not surprisingly, depending on the social background of the women. There is a marked difference between the middle-class Brahmin priestesses who are connected through informal training groups or work individually, often with the explicit support of their husbands, and those of non-Brahmin background who are often younger, who choose priesthood as full-time job, who leave their children in the care of other family members and who support their families economically through their profession and who, in return, gain economic independence and respect from their own family members. Here we see intersectionality at work. Even though this concept was developed by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 to describe the qualitatively different experiences of women of color and white women, it proves to be an important perspective for understanding the different experiences, the hierarchies and attitudes among Hindu priestesses in Pune, depending on their caste affiliation, their age, their marital status, and their economic situation. Here too, we are confronted not with a simple accumulation of difference, but with a qualitatively new differentiation that plays out differently in different situations. Many of the women who are not Brahmin by caste have been educated by the Jnana Prabodhini Sabha, an organization to, I quote, dedicated to, I quote, education, research, rural development, women power, with 10 centers in the Indian state Maharashtra. Jnana Prabodhini Sabha sees its role not just in the empowerment of women, but to a similar degree in the empowerment of non-Brahmin castes, promoting social reform and campaigning against so-called superstition and blind belief. most of the women studying with Jnana Prabodhini are of a lower caste background. I noted that the Jnana Prabodhini priestesses face a lot of criticism from other priestesses, and that the criticism directed at them is very similar to the criticism directed at the male priests. They are said to take shortcuts during their performances. It is claimed that they do neither thoroughly know the text they recite nor the rituals they perform, and some take issue with the payment policy of Jnana Prabodhini. Overall, the Jnana Prabodhini priestesses are considered not to perform in the proper Vedic way. Rather, they are characterized as modern, whereas the priestesses of urban Brahmin circles self-describe as traditional. While rarely mentioned explicitly, the caste affiliation is in fact an important issue here. While all Brahmin priestesses claim that all castes are welcome in their circles, many also mention assumed caste-specific physical restrictions. I was, for example, told some communities, that is castes, are not able to pronounce the mantras properly. One woman explained to me that the limitations of non-Brahmin caste also lies in the vocabulary they use. The diet of the ritual performers is also clearly perceived as a caste-specific obstacle. Often non-Brahmins follow a non-vegetarian diet. But only one Brahmin priestess was explicit about it. She said, the Jnana Prabodhini people are of different castes. They don't do it the traditional way. They are modern. A further group are the female priests affiliated to the Rashtra Sevika Samiti, a female branch of a right-wing Hindu nationalist organization. The group is well known for their rigid discipline and for being well organized. They see the fact that women today can become priestesses as a restitution of an original state. In the opinion of one female teacher, the initiation pranayana had originally existed for girls too, but had to be replaced by early marriage for young girls. And the myth behind this statement is narrated by her as follows. A Muslim ruler demanded that all unmarried Hindu girls had to marry him, and in order to protect the young girls, they were married to Hindu bridegrooms already at the age of 8. This practice of child marriage for girls, so the story goes, was then retained even under British rule. Only Indian independence reinstituted the independence for Indian women. These women thus conveniently attribute the fact that women until recently could not learn and perform Sanskrit rituals and the practice of child marriage to foreign rule imposed on Hindu subjects. We thus see a strategy to include women as ritual performers, which at the same time, with their simultaneous political goal of excluding non-Hindus from the group of morally upright inhabitants of India. Our close look thus revealed that women who perform Sanskrit ritual today are not part of one single movement. Among them, there are many different groups and individuals with a broad range of motivations from a wide variety of social and religious backgrounds who are engaged in similar activities, although for very different reasons and with different agendas. For the women trained by and working for the Jnana Prabodhini Sabha, performing as priestess is performing social reform. This is in sharp contrast to the agenda of the large group of less organized, urban, middle-class Brahmin women. They see their priestly activity not as an act of resistance, but are working towards what they see as a healthy renewal within the Brahmin tradition. And for those who learn and practice Sanskrit rituals in the context of right-wing Hindu nationalist organizations, performing as ritual specialist is nationalist and political work. As we can see, An important task for the researcher is to recognize the contradictions and conflicts among the women of one religious tradition, and to recognize that what can be interpreted as feminist activity comes in various forms, and also that some such activities can come at the expense of others. Lower caste women in one case and non-Hindus in the other. Yet all women embody and perform a pronounced shift in the religious and ritual agency of women in Indian Hindu traditions. They slowly but steadily create each their own spaces as public ritual performers. Let us move over to the second case study, the Pani Kanya Mahavidyalaya. Especially with the sobering exposure to right-wing Hindu nationalist priestesses, I approached another setting in India where women appropriate ritual rites and duties that are traditional reserved for male Brahmins. Now I actually looked for an undertone of right-wing nationalist politics and other potentially problematic motives and goals. The Panini Kanya Mahavidyalaya is a residential girls' school in Varanasi, which hosts up to 100 girls aged 8 to 22 years from all over India. In this school, in-depth practical and theoretical knowledge in Sanskrit and of Vedic rituals is imparted to the girls, complemented by training in martial arts, music, computer science, and other subjects considered secular. Varanasi, the city in which this school is located, is at the shore of the holy river Ganga and is considered by many the holiest city in India. It for a century has been and continues to be a center for Sanskrit learning and of Hindu orthodoxy. Similar to many traditional Veda schools for boys, the Panini Kanya Mahavidyalaya follows the Gurukul model, meaning that the students form a family, a kula, centered around the teacher. In this school, in every aspect of daily life, self-reliance is strongly emphasized. The girls cook and clean by themselves and also make their own firewood for the sacrifices. There are no male residents, although some guest teachers are male. And for the smallest girls, an elementary school teacher comes in. Importantly, much of the teaching is done by older students who teach those who are junior to them. In this way of teaching clearly confers confidence and deepens also the older students' knowledge about their subject. For example, during the daily sacrificial fire performed at the beginning of the day, the younger girls are seated in the outer circle, as we can see, whereas the experienced girls tend to the fire. The students are frequently called to perform rituals for clients. Asked why people take the unusual step to employ women for ritual services, the principal of the school explains that people ask for them because they are also lecturing and because they can explain the meaning of the rituals and mantras they perform and relate them to everyday life. She says, it is not only ritual, it is also knowledge. As you can imagine, the school also faces a lot of criticism, especially from Brahminic orthodoxy, which is very strong in Varanasi. Male teachers in Varanasi charge the girls and the teachers of the school with pursuing a faulty path. Yet, the girls are very well trained to counter criticism and are not hesitant to respond to the critics with Sanskrit quotes to make their point. They are frequently called to attend so-called Shastrata events, and here we see an image of that, which are public debates on the meaning and of normative texts in Sanskrit, in which they publicly display their textual knowledge. One of the students reported that they had organized an open challenge to all the male ritualists in 2019. The girls presented themselves at the scheduled time, but none of the male priests turned up. The girls suspect that the male ritualists are afraid of them, as their own training could not have matched the rigorous training that the girls undergo. And the girls certainly are much more serious about their training because they always find themselves challenged and are faced with the constant pressure to outperform the male counterparts. The agency that these girls embody and perform might therefore be similar to what Rinaldo labels pious critical agency, which she defines as the capacity to engage critically and publicly with religious texts. With this, Rinaldo expands on Saba Mahmood's recognition of female religious agency. Pious critical agency in many ways reflects a feminist agenda and the promotion of women's rights within conservative traditions, religions, challenging the assumption that feminism is inherently secular. The school also deviates in other aspects from the standard idea of what girls can and should learn. The girls are trained in martial arts such as judo, they do yoga, and they are trained in stick fighting and sword yielding. The head of the school says that the girls gain both self-confidence and physical fitness through these activities, an assessment that is confirmed by the girls. The physical training suggests a closeness to Hindu nationalist organizations such as the Rashtriya Sevika Samiti, in which the heroic girl and Vedic student are emphasized in creating a militant cadre of women. These roles, sanctioned by the organization, allow women to express a virulent and avenging agency and draw women into the political process as active agents. Implicitly, the underlying ideology seems to be reflected in the Panini Kanya Mahavidyalaya's girls' physical training. There is a further indication of closeness to the right-wing policy of the current Indian government. For the girls have indeed become the public face of spiritual India in Varanasi through a daily early morning performance on one of the popular bathing places, the Ghats at the river Ganga. This program is called Subah-e-Banaras and was initiated in November 2014, not by, but under the Modi government. The school has been involved in this program, which quite successfully aims to become part of the face of clean, rational, and renewed Vedic India. The event starts at 5:30 in the morning when the girls recite passages from Vedic texts. During the recitation, the splendidly clad young male priest enter the stage and start with the worship of the sun and the river Ganga. Then the girls start the sacrificial fire, again recite some Vedic verses, and perform the morning offering to the sun, the so-called Sandhya Vandana. Meanwhile, and when the girls then return to their school, meanwhile on Asigat follows a music program and then a public yoga program, both of which are regularly attended by locals and visitors alike. All these elements make for a nice traditional Indian curry, which is not too hot and easily digestible, a happy, clean, and enjoyable experience, especially for the visitors to Varanasi, foreign as well as Indian. And the girls' performance is central to this. It is important to keep in mind here that Varanasi is Prime Minister Narendra Modi's constituency, and Asigat and the morning program is linked, although indirectly, to Modi's efforts to clean up the Ghats of Varanasi, turning them into the poster child of traditional yet modern India. Poster child in the literal sense of the word. As I could witness in March 2018, French President Emmanuel Macron was taken by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi to Varanasi. They also visited Asigat, witnessing a specially arranged shortcut version of the Subah-e-Banaras program. While these aspects, that is the martial arts training and the involvement of the school in the daily morning program at Asigat shows that the school undoubtedly is closely associated with the ruling BJP party and thereby at least implicitly teams up with the Hindu nationalist agenda, interviews with the girls indicate that the attitude expressed by one senior student is more common. She emphasizes the commonalities of human beings, saying, "Our society teaches that every person, foreigners, Muslims, Jainas, Buddhists, they are all our brothers and sisters. For God, we are all the same." There is many perspectives one can take, and not one of them has universal validity. Though the martial arts practice and the physical training of the girls in the Panini Kanya Mahavidyalaya, through this, the girls undoubtedly acquire the confidence that they can fight and defend themselves. These young women learn to claim public spaces that are traditionally monopolized by men. Similarly, through the intense education of the girls, along with their public performance in Sanskrit and Vedic rituals, they claim and appropriate fields of knowledge and practice that are traditionally only taken up by men, and especially by high caste men. Yet, while the school has created a space where women challenge the patriarchal hold on the religion, among the girls, there is a marked shift in the objective from gaining ritual agency to being trained to get an employment in higher education, be it colleges or universities. 4, in spite of the fact that performing rituals is an important source of income for the school, interactions with the students reveal that most of them do not wish to become officiating priestesses. The students I've talked to, which are very enthusiastic about the school and happy to learn Sanskrit in such intensity, but many are aspiring to do their PhD at Benares Hindu University. To them, compared to employment as teachers in colleges or universities, officiating at ceremonies is a much less favored career. This stands in contrast to the initial objective of the school, which emerged out of the Arya Samaj reform movement, aimed at reform of the religious landscape rather than generating employment opportunities for girls. Getting back to my questions from the beginning, why do the women try to integrate in a tradition that excludes them? Common to all women is certainly their religious commitment, yearning for education, and urge to improve the tradition by getting back to the tradition's assumed roots. But some reasons also differ, depending on the background and context of the women. They are pursuing social reform, or they want to save their tradition from perceived threats. Some wish to improve their economic status, and some yearn for social recognition. These differences correspond to the different experiences and contexts of the women, which was another question I asked in the beginning. Yet, a common experience is definitely that of empowerment, new levels of independence going hand in hand with strong criticism and, importantly, solidarity among each other. This solidarity, however, does not cross all boundaries. In many cases, the higher degree of gender equality does in fact imply the exclusion of others. In my experience, when studying and engaging with such processes, an important challenge is to recognize and to acknowledge the contradiction and conflict among the women of a religious tradition, and to recognize different forms of agency, not only present in resistance and assertion, but also as pious critical agency, and as an agency that is activated within a religious context, yet leading to new opportunities beyond the strictly religious realm. Does the investigation of agency then help us at all? Yes, but it is evident that the investigation of female religious and ritual agency has to consider religious subjectivities in close interaction with other positions such as marital status, age, caste, class, regional identification and education, and many more. This requires a complex exploration of both women's experiences as multifaceted individuals and as members of different groups negotiating within and among various contexts. At times, restricting practices are experienced as empowering. Compliance can mask subversion, and compliance can be strategic. But importantly, women as agents of religion are performers of religious identity, and even conservative religions provide a set of skills and tools or other resources for agency and offer unexpected possibilities for empowerment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ute. This was truly rich and fascinating. As I said before you started, I welcome very much questions and comments for you, but also for the two panelists that we will have after a short break. So I think we will we'll just take a short break now until 15:15. So welcome back, everyone, and please prepare questions and write them in the Q&A. See you later in a very short time. Welcome back. I think we'll begin again now with our two respondents, and then there are questions constantly coming in that I will and I will moderate the talk afterwards. Our two respondents will comment on Ute Hüsken's talk from a historical and a philosophical perspective, respectively. And after their short responses, we then open the floor for a general discussion. So first, Unn Falkeid, professor in intellectual history at the University of Oslo. She specializes, among other things, in the late medieval and early modern female authors, especially in Italy. And she has studied the often astounding and political and theological agency of these women in early modern Europe. So I am excited to hear your response to this very rich and highly stimulating lecture. So please, Unn Falkeid. You have to be unmuted.
I have to be unmuted. Thank you. Do you hear me? Very well. Yes, that's very fun. Thank you, Kristin, and thank you very much, Professor Ute Hüsken, for this bright and thought-provoking talk. You raised a series of questions that seems both highly important and not at least timely to me. But let me also please apologize. Your talk deserves a far better qualified respondent than me. I'm working on late medieval and early modern European intellectual history, as Kristin said. However, one of my research topic is the 14th century author Birgitta of Sweden and her prophetic activities. I'm currently directing a research project entitled The Legacy of Birgitta of Sweden, Women, Politics and Reform in Renaissance Italy, which raises questions that are related to your investigations, such as female agency and the possibilities for women with religious and intellectual aspirations to move around in a male-dominated world.
Unn, I'm sorry, can you just put your microphone a little further from your mouth? Yeah, I think that's better.
Better?
Yeah.
Better? Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
Very good. You start your talk with clarifying that women within Hinduism, and especially those traditions that follow Sanskrit liturgy, have been excluded systematically from positions of religious and ritual leadership. You explain this exclusion by preserving Brahim textual traditions and by deeply rooted convictions regarding women's social roles and bodily constitutions. Despite these textual and social provisions, Hindu women question the male monopoly to a surprisingly increasing degree. As you argued, there is an ongoing radical change in the ritual landscape of India, and many women do now receive training in Sanskrit and in ritual practice. And many of these again actually perform as priestesses. You explain that your expectation was that these women were resisting a male Brahmin discourse on religious and ritual eligibility or aptness. But then your investigation have ended with more or less an opposite answer, or at least a highly nuanced conclusion. You point out three distinguished groups within this new cluster of female priestesses. You have the priestesses from the urban middle class Brahmin families who create respectable space for women. And you said most of them are widows or older women without really challenging patriarchal structures. The second group of priestesses are those connected to the reform movement, Arya Samai. These are women without any Brahmin background, and as such, they do not solely promote female religious authority. They also empower people in general from non-Brahmin castes. Finally, we have the group of priestesses connected to the right-wing Hindu national organization who paradoxically promotes female agency while at the same time reinforcing conservative and heavily aggressive patriarchal structures. So apparently feminist activities of the growing group of priestesses come, in other words, in a great variety of forms. Let me now take a detour through my own research before I will end this response with some questions. Birgitta of Sweden operated in an age with a strong misogyny within the Catholic Church. as I suppose you're highly familiar with, the hostility against women leadership was rooted both in classical philosophy, in biblical texts, as well as the theologians' often quite odd interpretations of these sources. In Birgitta's time, the misogyny was moreover confirmed in the canon law, the Decretium Gratiani, which strongly prohibited women to preach in public, to teach men, or to perform any priestly activities. Still, despite of these hostile attitudes against women, in the centuries so before Birgitta, a quickly growing group of lay women challenged the ecclesiastic male dominance. I'm referring to the Beguines, the religious communities of lay women who, despite never assuming any formal vows, lived ascetic and pious lives, not very different from their cloistered sisters. In contrast to nuns, however, who almost within every order experienced increasingly strict seclusion in the late Middle Ages, the Beguines lived in open communities. They were an urban phenomenon, attracting women from different classes and at all ages, and through activities such as charity work, schooling of children, and performing minor rituals reserved for men, they achieved great popularity. Let me stress that the Beguines frequently collaborated closely with men and with male preachers, such as the famous Marie Toigny. Sharing many of the same reform interests, especially members of the Franciscan order, considered the women with great favor. The Beguines' authority was often based on claimed divine visions. Let me hasten to say that the divine visions were a highly accepted genre and a fundamental part of the religious experience in the Middle Ages. Monks and nuns were instructed in the journeys towards the divine's visions. The problem, however, emerged when lay people outside of the controlled life of the monastery, such as the Beguines, started to claim to be in direct contact with God, which to a certain degree corrupted the ecclesiastic hierarchy. The critique increased in step with the Beguines' popularity, and at a certain point the church got enough. In 1317, Pope John XXII banned the movement. Those women who did not voluntarily enter an approved order would be prosecuted, something which, of course, led to a brutal witch hunt. In the wake of this hunt, a new theological genre appeared, the so-called discretio spiritum, or the discernment of spirits. The discretio spiritum became the church tool to discover whether a vision was true or false. Theologians started to be trained in the art, obviously with the aim of controlling heresy, and it was an effective weapon, especially used against women visionaries. However, and now I finally come to my point, discretio spiritum could also be applied in an opposite way. Birgitta established her authority in the wake of the Beguines. Despite the increasing resistance against women's voices within the church, she composed the most comprehensive literary oeuvre authored by a woman in the late Middle Ages. She founded a monastic order in her own devising, and this even in a period when the church had prohibited new orders. Finally, Birgitta was the only woman to be canonized in the 14th century. Part of this success, as we also see in generations following Birgitta, is that she knew how to deal with discretio spiritum, using it in a strategic or deliberate way. She simply read it as a guidelines in how she could behave in order to avoid to be judged. As such, it may be regarded as a compliance or submission that masked subversion, to use your expression. But let me now finally turn to my questions. You end your talk with a fascinating story about the girls' school in Varanasi, which I've was really wonderful. The girls obtain in-depth practical and theoretical knowledge in Sanskrit and in Vedic rituals, in addition to training in martial arts, music, computer science, and other secular subjects. They develop self-reliance, you say, they perform rituals, they attend public debates, etc. Yet you argue that they do not challenge patriarchal structures, as I understand you. It is a kind of reform from within, or caving out spaces for female authority without really subverting traditional hierarchies. But I wonder how this cannot be challenging. As I understand your lecture, these girls appropriate fields of knowledge and practice that are traditionally only taken up by men. Is the government's celebration of them a form of domestication? Another thing that struck me is how these girls avoid a religious career. Rather than becoming priestess, they prefer to go to the university or college. May not this also be understood as a resistance to a roughly male-dominated religious system? My final comment is more a hard side than a question. We often talking about progress with the idea that by accumulating knowledge, we are going to go in a direction of benefits that benefits everyone, such as progress within technology, medicine, historical understanding, tolerance, etc. However, when it comes to women, and especially women within religion, it is often difficult to use that word. Do you think that what is happening in India is going to continue? Will, for instance, the respect that the girls from the Varanasi school do meet affect women's situation in a broader sense within Hinduism? Or may it end such as it once ended with the Beguines and several other religious movements before and after them? Despite women's centuries-long struggle for authority, often with great success, such as in the case of Birgitta of Sweden, the Catholic Church still does not accept ordination of women, thus rejecting a true form of female agency and leadership. That was my comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Should I respond right now?
I suggest that you respond very briefly now or no. I give the word to our next respondent, and then you respond briefly to both of them, and then we have a range of questions too.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So please, our second respondent is Professor Jan Olav Henriksen, philosopher of religion at MF's Norwegian School of Theology, Religion and Society. And as you noticed, he also welcomed us all to this event in the beginning, before Ute's lecture, because he is also leader of MF CASR's board. And Professor Henriksen's perspective is a contemporary one. He specializes in the conditions of religion in the present Western world, and he's occupied also with the understanding of human beings and their conditions for agency. So he's also very appropriate respondent to this talk. And I give the word to you, pass the word to you, Jan Olav.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank Professor Hüsken for a very rich and nuanced lecture. And this lecture shows how important it is to do empirical research of religion, which can contribute to a more detailed and more complex picture of the constitutive elements of women's religious agency. It is very tempting to see the lecture as an opportunity to compare with what has been going on with women in the West regarding admission to priesthood. But I'm not going to do that, because there seems to be, although there seems to be important parallels, I think that to start with making comparisons would also entail the risk of overlooking the specific elements in the situations and the contexts that Professor Hüsken has researched. Nevertheless, what we know about women's religious agency conditions from elsewhere might also help us to dig deeper into some of the features that she has presented to us in this very excellent lecture. I will concentrate on a brief few points. First of all, as I understand it, all agency types presuppose that one has some power or some influence over one's own actions, choices, and conditions. That point notwithstanding, no agency is dependent exclusively upon one's personal conditions, as these individual conditions are always also constituted by the social and cultural environment of which the individuals are part, for good or for bad. And this point, I think, is very well illuminated in Professor Hüsken's lecture. My first comment is actually inspired by some selected elements in the American sociologist of religion Mark Chaffe's understanding of secularization. Although I'm not suggesting that it is a secularization process that's going on in India, I think that some elements in this theory still has something to say. The reason is that Mark Chaffee sees secularization from the point of view of how the extension of religious authority decreases. He defines religious authority as follows. I will define a religious authority structure as a social structure that attempts to enforce its order and reach its ends by controlling the access of individuals to some desired goods, where the legitimation of that control includes some supernatural component, however weak. In the lecture we have heard, we learned that this traditional patriarchal authority structure has lost some of its authority. One emergence of other practices or alternative practices of education, including reading sacred texts.
I think we missed you for a while, Jan Olav. There are some technical problems, it seems to be. Yeah, sorry about that. I think not to...
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, but you're still, you seem to be, try to stop the video and turn it on again. Yeah. Perhaps we lost him.
I think we did.
Yeah, that was, yeah, no, we're getting back. I hope. Okay, are you here, Jan Olav? There seemed to be a problem with the...
Can you hear me?
Yeah, okay, go on.
We actually lost you when you were talking, or at least I lost you when you said that the
okay. How much did you hear?
The patriarchal system seemed to have lost some of its authority. That's where I lost you.
There is
and then I quoted Mark Chaffe's. Did you hear that?
Yeah. He's gone again. Well, I think that's a pity. It really is. But I think not to lose time, we'll let him get back again. Okay, Jan Olav, is it better now, the connection? To me, it looks like the camera has sort of,
It's a hang-up of sorts. So I think.
Fine. The question is if you can hear me.
Yeah, but your connection is very weak and unstable, unfortunately.
Is it my camera?
Your camera is frozen.
I'm sorry about this.
Yeah, it's better now.
Okay.
Yeah, try to just to have the camera off and then continue with your comment.
Okay. Is it working? Please?
Yes.
Yeah, good. I'm sorry about this. I don't know. It should be good enough, but okay. To pick up then. In the lecture we have heard, we learned that the traditional patriarchal authority structure has lost some of its authority. And as I see it, this loss is anchored in two elements. One is the emergence of other practices of education, which includes reading sacred texts. And the other is the concrete experiences of women who are performing religious rituals and other types of agency. And both these features have parallels in how the conditions for women's religious agency are changing in other parts of the world as well. Moreover, Mark Chaves, in his theory, holds that secularization occurs or not as the result of social and political conflicts between those actors who would enhance or might maintain religion's social significance and those who would reduce it. This point is also well demonstrated in Professor Hüsken's lecture, at least to the point that there is a question about social and perhaps also political conflicts that is at the backdrop here. Because those who would like to limit the opportunities for women's agency will see their efforts as a way to maintain their own political and cultural significance, as they see change as a threat to the continued influence of the tradition. Actually, this is in line with how one earlier saw women's admission to the clergy as a result of secularization processes in Protestant Europe. It is probably inevitable that some will see changing conditions for women's religious agency as the result of a decline in the deference to religious authority. However, we should add that this is probably not merely a question of decline in traditional religious authority. We might also see the processes that Professor Hüsken describes as entailing transference of authority. This transference nevertheless also raises the question, to what extent are the women also seen as religious authorities? And the point here is, to what extent are they religious authorities, or are they maintaining their agency on the basis of the interests of others? Are the transference of agency to women part of the dissolution of traditional religious authority altogether? That would be my first main point here. What I'm pointing to is that some elements that constitute secularization theory allows us to read the developments that Professor Hüsken presents as entangled with elements that constitute secularization processes as well, notwithstanding that the cases she describes can hardly be seen as manifestations of secularization as such. The cases nevertheless show that change, as she describes it, is also related to elements that secularization theory applied to other parts of the world may capture. Another element that suggests similar or parallel approaches to secularization theory is the point of pluralization. There is a pluralization of practices and the manifestations of diversity of religious and other groups. I will not go into that to some extension here, apart from saying that the existence of different groups also may have some bearings for women's religious agency. Pluralization as one aspect of secularization is something that enables other conditions for women's agency than one dominant tradition might do. This is fairly obvious. However, given that there are pluralization processes, we may also expect what Professor Hüsken describes, namely conflict and rivalry. Conflict and rivalry among religious groups may be the result of some of the trajectories that are also at play in secularization processes that manifest struggles for power, influence, and agency, both within different religious traditions and between religious traditions and other parts of society. From a Western perspective, pluralization not only contributes to decreasing traditional religious authority, but also to less religious commitment overall. Is that the case also in India, or is the continued influence of women as priests and participating in priesthood and rituals something that actually enhances religious commitment? That would be my next question. Furthermore, changes do not come about merely by people reading sacred texts in new ways. And this is why religious scholars are not emphasizing texts as much as they used to. The changes come about because practices are also altered, and there are new alternatives in practice that contest traditional ways, both of reading texts and of using texts. This I call the pragmatic context of applying or using texts. In her lecture, Professor Hüsken analyzes several such processes that entails different types of practice. And she compares male and female ways of practicing rituals, which I find very interesting. One of the elements that she highlights is also how the ritual hosts, as she calls them, are important sources of success for women's female agency. These hosts, she tells us, are usually from middle-class Brahmin families. So both caste and class seems to be important here. It shows that the validation of the female ritual performance practice is not a given, but needs a social structure that provides a context of recognition and acceptance. It is likely that this is easier to establish in and by a stratum of society with some power and influence than it is or would be in poorer and rural areas. And this is something I would like to hear more about. It would be how women's improved opportunities to be religious agents are either restricted or enhanced as they are linked to class and caste. This would also, of course, entail that it would be interesting to hear more about the recruitment options of women with regard to class and caste. Finally, at the end of her lecture, Professor Hüsken points to how changes in the conditions for women's agency are entangled with political agendas. This is not surprising, but it shows that what can be seen as liberation from patriarchal structures may still place agency conditions within such structures. However, women can still experience that this is an expansion of their opportunities, but these opportunities remain within the limits of what others decide and over which others rule. Political interests will thus limit as well as provide new conditions for women's agency. Here it is tempting to ask, on whose premises is this agency really developing today? How much is still working on patriarchal conditions, despite the fact that we can identify so many new venues and so many new processes of enhanced female agency? These are just a few reflections based on a very rich lecture, for which I'm most grateful to Professor Hüsken for having presented this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan Olav. We are, there are many questions on the table now, and also from the audience. Please, Ute, could you just try briefly to answer the two respondents' questions, and then we'll, I hope we have time for most of the questions that the audience have posed.
So please. Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, first of all, let me thank you profusely for engaging in such depth with the presentation. And even though I cannot, of course, pick up every kind of thing that is on the table now, this will certainly be very important for me to think further about the material that I'm working on. So Professor Falkheit, I really appreciate how you brought in Brigitte of Sweden and also kind of showed how here the agency of women evidently has become or has changed through the activities and also, I mean, through the intellectual capacity of this woman and her followers, and how she evidently strategically also employed concepts that were maybe designed to subdue her. So she was clearly in the position to use it to her own advantage and to the advantage of those who were following her. That is a quite interesting example, and I do, even though I think that we do have a profound difference here, because the women I was talking about are not part of a monastic or any ascetic community. And I do think that at least in the Indian context, this is a profound difference because it pertains to the female body, it pertains to control of sexuality, and it pertains to how women, I mean, what kind of agency is attributed to women and what kind of agency women can actually unfold. And I do think that the question of being in a monastic community is here something that we really have to take into account. I do like your remark that that the morning program that the girls, the Kanyas, are doing at Asigat might be seen as a form of domestication. And I'm in line with this interpretation. I do think it is definitely a form of domestication. At the same time, I see that even here, this, let's say, new and different form of domestication and trying to rein in the agency of these girls in certain ways, even that doesn't work fully because it spills over. It's still, I mean, and that is really why I think it is so important to do empirical research, something that Professor Henriksen also emphasized, is it, even though there are restrictions, it can be used in subversive ways, and it maybe always will be used in subversive ways. So it's not, in the end, it's not the question, is it this or that, but it's more the question, what do we choose to look at and why? So I think there's always a multiplicity of factors at work. Then there was your important question about progress. Well, progress is also is a term that evaluates change, and I'm sure what is for one group progress is decline for the other group. I mean, that is exactly the possibility for women now to perform rituals. We saw that in this one of the small videos where one person said, well, everything's going downhill. That's why women are now in the position to perform or to embody this agency. Whether this will have wider effects, I do think yes, not just because it's seen as progress by some, but also because let's say the field of religious specialist is an ambiguous one. The religious specialists, especially performers who do this in the public sphere, are seen in very ambiguous terms, because on the one hand, religious specialists are, through their eligibility and through their, let's say, abilities of communicating with the transcendent, with the divine, whatever it is in the specific case, they are in a privileged position to mediate between the beyond and the here, which puts them in a position of power. At the same time, what we see from texts which start with the Christian era, we also see that they always have been viewed with suspicion. So there was always a suspicion that, which we also find today, that they don't know what they're doing and they are doing this for money. And there was always this distrust. Does it really work? And do they really know what they're doing? So it's both. So which has as an effect that religious specialists do have a very ambivalent position, which is then expressed in the criticism towards male priests. They don't know what they're doing. They're just doing their blah, blah, blah. They don't know what it means. And here it is where the women come in and say, well, we know what it means, even though, of course, there's a wide range of meanings that you can attribute to rituals. That's what rituals is basically about. Whether it will have long-term repercussions, whether it will be a bigger development, I have no idea. I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that, I mean, looking at the political development or development worldwide, I think we're going backwards rather than forwards. So I'm very skeptical when it comes to progress in this sense. Professor Henriksen, thank you very much for your also bringing in the concept of secularization, or at least some aspects that are connected to that. And I fully agree that this, in the cases that I displayed, the loss of, let's say, male authority, let's put it like that, is certainly on the one hand connected to the concrete experience. And that is something of women performing. That is something that I very frequently hear. And it is very often also connected to aesthetic experience. Their chanting is nicer. They do it more gracefully. And, but also, as I said, when talking about their popularity with the hosts, they are much more catering to the host's demands and wishes. Whereas the male priests rather seem to tend to just come in, do their thing, go out again, and out of, let's say, at least that is the perception of the host, out of understanding that, well, I mean, it doesn't, no one needs to understand it, because these rituals work if they are performed properly by the proper people. And so it's not important to understand what is going on. It's important that it is performed and that and only this makes it work. Whereas clearly most of the women see this in a very different perspective. So this is also a question of how the different groups of performers, what kind of ontological status they attribute to the rituals they perform. So I think that I answered the question about disillusionment. I am, let me just see. You were one of the questions, which is, I think, a very important question, is that you say that that you at least suspected that the new practices are validated by a certain social structure, and that is perfectly right. I mean, what I was trying to emphasize throughout my talk is that especially the female priests in Pune, they are embedded in a certain economic setting and in the certain caste setting where this works. As soon as these women go into the villages and try to perform there, it doesn't work, at least not yet. So I mean, that's what many of the priestesses told me is, yeah, when we go to the villages, they always want us to take a male priest along. So there should be a male authority, because only then the, let's say, efficacy of the ritual is guaranteed. That at least in, let's say, in a rural context. And that also spins off into recruitment options. It seems that some of the priestly groups also start education camps. So they connect their, let's say, religious agenda with the educational agenda, which is very well received in the villages. And so through the educational agenda comes in more acceptance of female religious specialists, simply because it goes hand in hand, and it so it has one advantage and the other is kind of walks along with it. Yeah, maybe I just stop here now, but let me thank you again for both the responses, which are really good, and I need to think about some of it more before giving a refined response. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks to both the respondents for their thoughtful comments and questions. We have a lot of questions also from the audience. I'm afraid we cannot take all of them, but I'll give you some. Iselin Frydenlund, who you know, says, "Dear Ute, many thanks for a great lecture. My question relates to what you, in your new edited volume on this topic, refer to as the feminist ethnographer's dilemma. This relates to the often implicit understanding that the researcher share political agenda with their partners in the field with regard to understandings of feminism and or political positions such as exclusionary nationalism, racism, and xenophobia. How do we researchers deal with such potential ethical dilemmas? How do we explicitly engage with such complexities?" Iselin asks.
It's a tricky question, and of course, Iselin is working with Islamophobia also among Buddhists, but I mean, we have the same situation in the Hindu context, and that is, it is a dilemma, I think, and I think the first thing, how do we deal with it? We need, as researchers, we need to, and that is maybe a more personal response, but we need to be aware of our own limitations, how much we can take, and how much we are willing to take based on our, let's say, own political understandings of who we are in the world. If we choose to engage with situations in which we strongly disagree with the political agenda of those who we are working with, and this of course refers to an implicit feminist agenda or whatever, I guess we need to be aware of these preconditions and be explicit of these preconditions, because they also, I mean, it starts when we choose our topic. I mean, if I choose to research Buddhist monastic law and the rules for nuns, it doesn't come out of nowhere, and we need to be aware of it and need to be explicit about it, inform the consumers of our products, so of our writing of this. At the same time, and I do think that we don't have to shed this, we don't have to leave this at home, but we need to be explicit about what part of our research is informed by a political agenda, and where are we in terms of, let's say, feminist, where is our methodology? This is the only answer I can give to this, to be aware of it and to be explicit about it. And then it depends on who you are and what the field is. But I think we need to be aware that the field will always surprise us and not always in pleasant ways.
A second question comes from Marion Grau, who asks you to say more about the function of caste in the dynamic that you have described. The liberation of Brahmin women seems to be able to include a sense of interreligious hospitality, but not to lower class Indians. She asks, I see parallel to other feminist movements, such as in the West, where it was only a particular caste, so to speak, that had access to female agency, while sidelining ethnic minorities. In other words, as you mentioned, this happens in the context of Hindu nationalism, but appears somewhat open to the young women's own interpretation that may be more inclusive and expansive. Do they see a connection between their own reframing of the tradition to a way of breaking other barriers, such as between castes? And then she thanks you for a fascinating lecture.
If we talk about the Kanyas, so the girls in the second example, I think they are very, due to the institutional history of this school, they are very aware of caste, and I do think that there's hardly any context in India where you cannot be aware of caste. So you're always, in one way or another, you need to relate to caste dynamics. And the school's attitude is we take everyone irrespective of caste, and that is also what the girls would say. At the same time, if you look at the demographics, this is of course not the case, not because the school would reject a certain members of certain castes, but this is not the case because certain castes would simply not, that is not an option, or also not necessarily attractive to them. I was, since you were mentioning interreligious connections, I was explicitly asking in this school about the question of whether if a Muslim girl came, if they would be accepted as a student in the school. And there was a very strong yes, but they have to accept our preconditions. And that is, they would have to wear the sacred thread, they should not eat non-vegetarian diet, and they have to recite the mantra. But it never has happened clearly that a Muslim girl wanted to or was supposed to join. At the same time, they also say, I mean, the head mistress of the school says that their example in the city of Varanasi has also emboldened Muslim community, women of Muslim communities to demand to also be able to say the prayers and get more, let's say, religious authority within their communities, but not in the Hindu community. It's complex.
So I continue. We are a little after schedule now, but there are so many questions. So I hope that people hang on for a little while, and we can take most of them, not all, I'm afraid. Katinka Frøystad also thanks you for an interesting talk, and she asks, would it be possible to argue that underneath the muscular Hinduism that some scholars have referred to as a masculinization, for instance, Thomas Blom Hansen, there is a contradictory tendency of feminization going on? In other words, are we seeing a double movement of sorts, she asks.
This is a brilliant idea. I have never connected these 2 points, and I do think that it's really worthwhile thinking about it and looking for it actively, which I haven't done. So I'm unfortunately not in the position to say yes or no, but I thank you a lot, Katinka, for this line of thought. That's certainly worthwhile pursuing. Full stop.
Yeah. Here's another question from Mumita Sen. It's a question and a comment. She asks, how clear is the distinction between reformatist practices within what scholars call neo-Hindutva, such as Sanskrit schools and social reform, or NGOs doing what is still clearly Sanskritations or Brahmization of women of the oppressed cases? For example, the martial art practices you read as emancipatory among the young students of the Benares school has been widely written about in female militant Hindutva organizations, such as the Durga Vahini. I'm sorry for, I'm not familiar with this, how you pronounce these names. The explicit purpose of this training to fight the rapacious Muslim man and protect the chastity of the Hindu female body and the feminized body of the nation. What is your comment?
Maybe I was not explicit enough about it, but that is actually a connection that I drew between the, let's say, physical exercises of the girls, which is part of the educational program of the school. And I do think that this is really closely connected also in terms of terminology. Yet we cannot deny that it also allows the girls to be different in the space of Varanasi, to have a different self-perception and so on, irrespective of the political background of this training. But of course, yes, I mean, the Panini Kanya Mahavidyalaya school, this school has its roots in Arya Samaj, and so also many of the textbooks they use are Arya Samaji textbooks, and also they recruit mainly among Arya Samaj families. So there is a very, very close connection to these neo-Hindu movements, social reform, and so on. But at the same time, it is not, I think it is, we need to differentiate even more by looking at specific practices and what they do. Because saying, okay, this is Arya Samaj or whatever, this is Hindutva, that doesn't do justice to what is going on. At least it's not just that. And that is one important point that I try to make with my lecture.
I'll give you two more questions before we end. From Joël Bourdon, he wonders what is the limit of the term Sanskrit Hinduism as you employ it in your lecture? Are these women purely interested in Vedic Brahmin rites like the samskaras, or have you also seen any interest in temple priesthood, acting as gurus, etc.? On a related note, do any of these groups take recourse to Dharma Sanskrit traditions that draw also on the tantras, which women and strudas would traditionally have been able to access?
Very important question, especially the question for regarding the temple rituals. And as you clearly noticed, what I have been talking, have been talking about is mainly rituals, to become a ritual specialist in for domestic rituals, which would be life cycle rituals and so on. To work or to assume the position as temple priests or in this case as temple priestesses, is again a very big step into, on the one hand, the public sphere, but also it is a big step into territory that is highly contested. When I was in Pune in 2014, I think it was 2014, there was at that point, during this time, was a big, let's say, discussion going on about the temple priesthood in Pandharpur. And while I was there were women by politicians. So it was a political decision to install 2 women in the Pandharpur temple as priestess for Rukmini Devi, so for the goddess installed in this temple, which is a radical step, and it was a clear political statement. The background, it had to do with, let's say, alleged corruption that was going on in the temple. But that was something that concerned the, let's say, Brahmin priestesses in Pune a great deal. They were really worried about who was appointed there as a female priest. And so we actually went there together because they wanted to look at these women who were appointed as priestesses and also wanted to educate them, tell them what they should do and should not do, because there was also the rumor that they were not Brahmin women. So there is a huge step between public performance in the temple and, let's say, the form of public performance when it comes to stepping out of your own domestic sphere into someone else's domestic sphere. So this is clearly a very important point, and there is hardly, as far as I know, hardly any movement to claim temple rituals for women. There, when it comes to temple rituals, it's much more discussed whether low castes should be allowed to perform as priests. Much more, this form of exclusion is discussed and contested, but not so, hardly that women should do that.
So the last question will be from Silje Einarsen, who says that it seems to me that the priestly education inspires women to conform and uphold traditional patriarchal norms of caste and gender, although sometimes in a reinterpreted sense. Although maybe empowering them on certain arenas, could it not also be seen as pushing them back in terms of gender equality, she asks.
Depends on who you ask. Of course you can, yes, of course you could say that, but I don't think that this doesn't help us anything. If we are looking at religion and we do not assume just a priori that religion is against women. But if we accept that religion can be in whatever ways empowering for women, then we should be, I think we should take that seriously. And I think we should take the women seriously who perform as ritual or religious specialists, and how they see their situation. And then I'm again back to this, we need to look at the empirical givens. The same action for one woman can be immensely empowering, whereas for other women it would be disempowering. But we really need to look at that, I think, in the first place, before we make general statements. And the more I look into details, the less I'm inclined to make general statements.
Yeah, that's that last comment is, I think, a kind of insight shared with scholars in many fields. Yeah. I think we have to close this session now. Thank you all for your questions. There were many more that we could not discuss because we are running out of time. And I would just very much like to thank, of course, our prominent annual lecturer. It was a great pleasure to hear you, Ute, and thanks to our two very well prepared and very insightful respondents, and to the audience and to all your engagement. I would just like to pass on a greeting from Rector of MF, Vidar Hånes, who says that due to the circumstances, he was not able to welcome you in person. But on behalf of all of the leadership of MF, as the Rector of MF, he will give a special and deep felt thank to Professor Hüsken for accepting the task to give the MF CASR annual lecture and for giving us such an excellent and important lecture. Rector would also like to thank Professor Falkeid and Professor Henriksen for their well-prepared comments and questions. And I, as the director of MF CASR, I'm very, very happy to have all of you here during this event. And thank you for coming. And I hope that next year we will be able to meet in person and go out and celebrate afterwards, which we cannot do now. So thank you all, and yeah, goodbye.
I would also like to thank everyone for this really engaging discussion, and I am taking a lot with me that I can think about even more. And I'm looking forward to having an Ute Pils with everyone next year when I hopefully be able to come. Okay, thank you.